Thank you. It's students like that that keep us all teaching here in spite of everything. It's a great pleasure to see so many friends and former students and colleagues here, and I'm feeling a little guilty because I have a feeling that everything I'm going to tell you, you already know. But this talk builds on some projects that I've been working on for the last several years, and it's sort of all coming into place as one thing. I was originally going to begin this talk by quoting André Malraux, whom people used to read, but I don't think they read anymore. But because of my good friend Leo Steinberg's death this weekend, I've been thinking a lot about Leo, as many of us at the school have been. He was a great friend of the school and enormously generous with his time. And I was thinking about his seminal essay, The Eye is a Part of the Mind, which was his challenge to formalist criticism. I recommend you all reread it. It's a pretty stunning, prescient piece. The artists I'm going to talk about tonight in most detail are artists who have been associated with formalist criticism, who have been championed by Clement Greenberg, Michael Fried. But I think the kind of criteria that Leo Steinberg suggests are applicable in The Eye is a Part of the Mind are just as applicable to their work. And one aspect of their work that I think justifies that claim is the fact that they have felt themselves to be so connected to the past, which all the artists in the room here take for granted. It's one of the founding tenets of the studio school, as exemplified by the T.S. Eliot essay that I make my students read, Tradition and the Individual Talent. That only by thoroughly understanding and assimilating tradition in the past do you have a chance of building on that and doing something that is really new. Of course, that's a very familiar story. All you have to do is look and reimagine. Think of these as black and white slides. It'd be much more accurate. Of course, Manet's celebrated The Old Musician in the Chesterdale collection at the National Gallery, which is a deliberate homage, as many of his early works are, to a well-known work of the past, Velázquez's Bacchus, which deeply, deeply informs the Manet. Well, that's why I was going to begin with André Malraux. In his book, The Voices of Silence, which was published in 1953 and was still assigned reading when I was an undergraduate, Malraux stated that what makes an artist is that in his youth he was more deeply moved by his visual experience of works of art than by the things they represent, and perhaps of nature as a whole. That's a pretty astonishing idea. If it's true, it implies that there's an unbroken causative link between artists that stretches across time, which is something we all take for granted here, like the connections between musicians or dancers whose art is passed down body to body through direct experience from teacher to pupil. Today's students at the School of American Ballet, for example, who were born long after Balanchine's death, are taught by dancers who worked with Balanchine. just as they were taught by dancers, or Balanchine and his generation were taught by dancers who worked with Petipa and Wilkin, and you can trace their lineage back to the invention of ballet at the court of Louis XIV. Now, Pace Leo Steinberg, a variation of Malraux's idea of the history of art's dependence on unbroken continuity, can be found in Clement Greenberg's often stated claim that modernism was not a rupture with the past, but, as he put it, a holding action for quality. According to Greenberg's model, as everybody knows, modernist painters and sculptors were driven to challenge accepted norms, not because they rejected tradition, but because they wanted to equal the potency and the intensity of the work from the past that they admired. The challenges modernist artists issued, Greenberg suggests, took the form of each discipline's gradually purging itself of everything that was not intrinsic to it. For painting, that included narrative and illusionism. But that's subject for another discussion, and that's exactly what Steinberg takes exception to in his essay. What's more relevant is that both Greenberg's contention and Malraux's contention affirm in very different ways that the art of the past and the present are seamlessly connected. That modernist artists look to the past for stimulus and support is hardly news. And there are countless examples. I could have showed you Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which is, of course, based on Titian. In fact, it used to be Giorgione, now it's the young Titian. This could change at any moment, but the last news I heard, Neville, is there something I don't know? Okay, we have a Renaissance expert in the second row who will correct me. I could have shown you Olympia in relation to Titian also leaning on classical antiquity and on Raphael via the engravings of Marcantonio. Manet was absolutely frank about this, as we know from his marvelous portrait of Zola, because if you look at what's in the background, you can see a Japanese print. Well, that's something we all know, that artists of this generation started looking to Japanese prints, not as ethnic curios, but as alternatives to the kind of academic tradition that some of them had been educated in. And then next to the Japanese print is, you see, a reproduction of Velázquez's Bacchus. And then just in case you don't get it, there's a little version of Olympia reminding us that Manet was playing with those sources. Manet, as I say, was absolutely frank about these sources, about the connections between his work and the art of the past, his ambition for the company in which he wanted his art to be judged. And it's exactly the same way that he allowed his brushstroke to show in the thinly painted passages of large-scale paintings, which so disturbed his viewers at the time these paintings were first shown. It was quite all right to do that in a sketch, not in a painting the size of Déjeuner sur l'herbe. And that was so upsetting that it obscured his references to the past, made it impossible to think of Olympia or Déjeuner sur l'herbe as anything but rude transgressions. And the criticism of the period rarely mentions connections with past masterworks. It debates what class of prostitute Olympia might be. That was seen to be a more urgent question. Manet, often described as the first modernist, could also be called the last old master, a reluctant innovator, compelled to flatten and simplify forms and disregard 19th century conventions of finish in order to come closer to the intensity of the works that he was demonstrating his admiration for. But Manet, whether a deliberate or an unwilling rebel, was hardly the only person. Cézanne copied works in the Louvre assiduously. He remained fascinated with Delacroix, with Titian, as Delacroix himself was. And of course, Cézanne famously pitted himself against another great admirer of Titian, Poussin. So you can keep connecting all of these things. Van Gogh copied Delacroix's work, used prints of Delacroix as the starting point for his own work, and said he didn't understand why painters couldn't be like musicians. Musicians weren't expected to compose their own work. But Manet can serve as our paradigm here. The landscape on the left, whose connection to Rubens's landscape on the right is extremely obvious. He seems to conflate a number of Rubens's here. And of course, you can move closer to the present and find Matisse using as his starting point the 17th century Dutch still life painter de Heem. You'll have to mentally translate the orange in the Matisse on the left to yellow and add some blue to the green. There's nothing we can do about that. We have tried. It looks great on the screen, but not with the projector. Now, is this the same thing that Manet was doing? Not exactly. And then Manet is using the Titian prototype, the Rubens prototype, as a guide, as the suggestion for compositional strategies. Matisse is adhering much more faithfully to the de Heem. You can find justification for just about everything in the Matisse, in the de Heem. But it's all transformed. It's not a transcription. It's been translated into a fragmented Cubist language. This is 1917 painting. And standing in front of this painting in the last big Matisse show, where it was very conspicuous, it struck me that this was Matisse saying to his Cubist colleagues, all right, you want geometric planes, you want fragmentation, you want dislocation of space. I can do that. And I can do it through the 17th century. So I think it's a kind of double whammy here. It's a reinterpretation of a painting which Matisse knew well. He had copied it, quite literally, early on. And if you remember that there was the copy was in the exhibition as well, reminding us of Matisse's very faithful rendition of the painting, and then many years later, this complete transformation, making it into something which is both completely his own and dealing with an approach to space which he, I think, was trying to challenge his colleagues. Matisse's relation to the past is very easy to document, as easy as Manet's in many ways. The pose of the sculpture Aurora is very obviously derived from Michelangelo's Dawn in the Medici Chapel. Matisse had a photograph of the Michelangelo on his mantelpiece and returned over and over again in his work to this pose in sculpture and in painting. In the Blue Nude of 1907, which is more or less contemporaneous with the sculpture, he is revisiting this pose again, and I could have shown you works right up until the last blue cutouts in which he is reprising this pose, which resonated for him. But what about artists of our own time? Well, someone who is as celebrated as an abstract painter as Helen Frankenthaler has a very similar relationship to past works. The picture on the left is her Fabritius bird of 1960, a very small, very faithful, almost transcription of the celebrated Caro Fabritius goldfinch in the Marz house. I say almost a transcription because if I'd shown you that without the actual reproduction of the Fabritius on the right, you would have thought the Frankenthaler was more faithful than it is. She is very attached to the specifics of the bird and the perch, but she's transformed the play of dark and light. She's isolated the configuration of the bird and its perch in the center of the picture and translated it into her own language of blotting and staining and free-floating forms. But she's clearly rendering homage to this magical little painting. And that is something she does throughout her life. It begins far earlier than 1960. This is a 1958 drawing in colored pencil, also very small. It's about the size of a normal 8.5 by 11 sheet. And that is very closely based on a small Degas bronze bather washing her left leg, which Frankenthaler owns. So this, again, is a piece that she knows very, very intimately, and that she is using as a starting point. Again, transforming it. I mean, if I showed you that without the title and the sculpture, you might think it's somehow inspired by Miro in another context. That's 58. She has made many different ways of connecting with the past. This is a painting called simply Chada. As far as I know, it's not based on a specific Chada work. It's more of a general expression of admiration, enthusiasm, and understanding of Chada in her own language. Again, I mean, if I didn't know the title, I might relate this to Dubuffet or something. That is a handprint on the left, something she did very often in the 50s, as though asserting her presence. It may have had a beginning in losing her balance and putting her hand down on a canvas on the floor, but she decided to keep it. And often she'll put in fingerprints, she'll put in deliberate marks, stating that she made this, that this is not just paint moving around by itself, but there's an author, there's an intelligence, there's a particular person who's behind it all. A painting 20 years later called M, which is her code for Manet. She doesn't usually refer to the artists whom she is alluding to by name. In some of her more ambitious paintings, there's homage to H.M., which is Henri Matisse. There's another painting called For E.M., who is Edouard Manet, and it's an improvisation after the Chicago Manet still life with a carp. And this one, which has no particular cognate, but is again her improvising. It's not as purple as the magic of PowerPoint makes it appear. It's her comments on early Manet, where he is pulling lights up against darkness, in himself rendering homage to the Spanish painters whom he was so excited about, Zurbarán, Ribera, and, of course, Velázquez. But earlier, and later, as we will see, Frankenthaler, this is a 56 painting called Venus and the Mirror. This is very, very specifically about the Titian painting in the National Gallery in Washington. And if you start looking carefully at the Frankenthaler, which is probably about the same size, the heights are fairly accurate for once, but of course the Frankenthaler is much squarer than the Titian. The elements in the Frankenthaler start having something to do with the Titian, but not in the way you would expect. She gets interested in inner movements, in implied shapes, and conflates them and moves them around. That floating dark shape, surrounded by the vertical lines and that kind of boxy thing in the middle, I believe is a very direct reference to the wing of the Cupid. It's in a different position. I think that rectangular schematic quasi-gridding has something to do with the shoulders and the arms of Venus, or possibly it's just about the space between Venus and Cupid. We can't identify things one-to-one, but we can find general characteristics. The way that dark rectangle comes in from the left, breaking into the rounded shapes, I think has something to do with the drape over Venus's, let's see, it's her proper right arm. And you can keep finding these connections. Nothing that is utterly precise, but things that are derived from the painting. The diagonal slash across the painting is certainly something to do with that diagonal movement of Venus's arms, but not in a literal way. And that's typical of the way she approaches these things. A large, very large, it's about a 20-foot painting, so you're going to have to do some fancy reinterpretation here. Frankenthaler on the left, called Hint from Bassano, a 1973 painting. And the Bassano from which she took her hint is the Jacopo Bassano flight into Egypt in the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena. And here again, you can see, even through the ghastly transformation of the color here, some things remain intact, like the orange drapery, which has something to do with the orange shapes there, and those open-ended bracketing shapes on the right, which are her response to the gesture of the angel's arms on the right of the Bassano, leading Joseph and Mary out of the canvas eventually. And again, that wash of dark color on the left of the Frankenthaler, which has its origins in that big dark shape in the left half of the Bassano. But if you look at the background of the Bassano, the landscape, which is very much subordinate to everything that's happening in the foreground, I think you'll find, again, some clues as to where that big horizontal shape shading into blue comes from. And the Y-shaped brownish stain in the Frankenthaler probably has something to do with the tree in the Bassano. So things shift scale. They change their relative importance. They obey the dictates of the new painting, but they're informed by her scrutiny of the work from which she takes her starting point, and they're informed by her enthusiasm for the painting. Sometimes the connections are fairly indirect. The painting on the left, called Piero, and that lavender band on the right is not actually part of it, it's part of the background, and again, if I were giving instructions in the old days when things used to be done with 4 color separations, I would tell the printer, less red, and it would look much better. But digitally, I don't know how you do that. The excruciatingly hideous color reproduction on the right, where all the pinks have turned to red, is of course the Brera altarpiece of Piero della Francesca in Milano. And the angel just to the right of the Madonna, whose robe is more like the light blue in the Frankenthaler, is the source of this painting. There was a poster that was made of this painting focusing on that angel with a slice of the Madonna's robe. This poster hung in the bathroom of Frankenthaler's friend Tony Caro's studio for many years, and she was working in Caro's studio making sculpture, got interested in this poster, and the painting was the result. Not a direct connection to anything except a kind of free-floating visual stimulus. Which is why one, in a sense, does this with Frankenthaler a little bit at one's peril. It's a little bit like taking her titles too literally, as the organizers of the exhibition Frankenthaler and the East and Beyond seem to have done. In many cases, though, she has talked about these connections and been as overt about them as Manet. So we can take them quite literally. But you also have to remember that she's going to do what's good for the painting, her painting, never mind what the original source is. Here, the painting on the left should be considerably bigger. The source, talked about frequently, is the Courbet Mediterranean in the Phillips collection, and the painting on the left is called Mediterranean. But where Frankenthaler decides the painting needs the black, and where where Courbet thinks it needs the darkest part, are completely opposite. She will invert, she will change direction of the orientation of the painting, she will acknowledge the source, but transform her own picture according to what she thinks that picture needs. And then you get curious things. The painting on the left, again a very large painting, is called Buddha. I think it's called Buddha because when she saw what she had done, that big triangular shape had vague associations for her with a meditating Buddha figure. But she has also talked frequently about the source of the painting, which is another painting in the Norton Simon, a Zurbarán still life from 1633. That's where the yellow comes from, that's where that circular form comes from, and the big Buddha-like stain from which the painting takes its title probably has to do with the basket. So it's, even when the source is acknowledged, when the specific source is there, something else will take over. She's also, oh dear, looks fine up here. These sources, I think, provide a kind of security. They give her a place to start, and that seems to be a very clear indication in her one foray into sculpture in Caro's studio in 1971. The sculpture on the left, which is probably about 8 feet high at its tallest point, is called Matisse Table. And she said that she used as her point of departure the table in Matisse's Pineapple, the 1948 painting in Pompidou, which isn't really indigo blue. again, very, very freely used. You can find even fewer cognates here than you could in anything that we've been looking at, and it's not just because she translated it into 3 dimensions. It's because it's an idea that contained within the source that triggers her own associations and her own inventions. Very, very characteristic is the relationship between Matisse's portrait of Madame Matisse in 1913 and Frankenthaler's painting, which is probably about 6 feet across, called Madame Matisse, 1983, exactly 70 years after the original. We can find justification for all the colors in the Frankenthaler, and believe me, it's a lot closer in the actuality than in these black and white images. The boa becomes the great orangey gesture at the bottom. There's an all-over blue-green tonality of the painting, which is very close to Madame Matisse's vest or blouse, and then, of course, the floating spots of black have cognates in the uninflected black eyes and the very modish little hat. But there's no formal relationship between those elements and the original painting. It's Frankenthaler extracting the things that she perhaps remembers best from the painting, its remarkable color, and turning it into something that is completely Frankenthaler. And again, without the title and without her pointing us towards the painting, we probably would have no idea that there was any kind of source. It's something that, as I say, she did at the very beginning of her career, throughout her long life as a painter, and even in '94, when she did one of her last series of works on paper, the Lighthouse series. Which is more, the image on the left is, the dark area is more transparent and more inflected and has light patches in it, which seem to have eluded this projector. And there, again, we know that the trigger came from a postcard of a Monet water lily, Monet weeping willow that came from a series of his late garden pictures. And that triggered this extrapolation in the middle of a series of works on paper which are vaguely landscapey, but again, non-specific. So it's a constant conversation between the history of art, her materials, whatever else is going on in her perceptions, because frequently her work is informed by her experience of landscape, of changing light, of nature in her studios. All of this conflated to make, as I say, works that are unmistakably Frankenthaler, but which she acknowledges have other connections. Something very similar obtains in the work of Frankenthaler's good friend, Anthony Caro. Caro has often said that he has looked to paintings, often to Matisse, for suggestions about how to finish sculptures, how to develop sculptures. His celebrated Early One Morning, which is in the Tate, painting that's a sculpture that's quite compressed by the angle from which it's photographed, but is in fact about 20 feet long, turns out to have a lot to do with Matisse, particularly the painting called The Window that's in the Detroit Institute of Art. No overt relationship in terms of the structure of the parts. It's as though Caro blew the painting apart, and of course the dominant color of the painting is a greenish blue, and this is definitely a red sculpture. He is often very responsive to the particulars of his environment in the same way. 1987, he spent a good deal of time in Barcelona, a city that he said was all about line, by which he meant the omnipresent Catalonian ironwork and balconies and street furniture, so that his sculptures made in Barcelona respond to that. Now, in part, it's because he was cannibalizing abandoned railings and ruined bits of industrial ironwork, but he could very easily have not chosen to use those parts or used them in different ways. So there's this kind of riff on the Catalonian balcony turned into about a 6 or 8 foot freestanding sculpture. This is just one of a series. But often he is much more specific about his sources. This is a piece made in '85 after a trip to Greece. He had resisted going to Greece, partly because he'd had an academic training at the Royal Academy schools and was not the least bit interested in Greek sculpture, until he went to Olympia and discovered the pediment of the Temple of Zeus, with the west pediment with the battle of centaurs and lapiths, whose violence is being calmed with that extraordinary gesture of Apollo reaching his arm out. The Caro after Olympia is a series of, it's rather hard to see in this slide, I admit, a series of individual volumetric parts which are arranged the way the individual sculptures in the pediment are. There's no, again, one-on-one relationship, except you see that curving bit in the middle, which is perhaps an equivalent of that outstretched arm of Apollo. It's a piece that you really need to experience by walking alongside of it. You have to be close to it. And then you become very aware of the corporeality and the physicality of each of these units and measure them against your own body, and you measure their volumes against your sense of your own body, which is perhaps the kind of representation, reference to humanity that Leo Steinberg is referring to in his essay. As far as I know, this is the only sculpture Caro has ever made about a sculpture. His sources are invariably paintings. After Olympia, for all its uniqueness as a sculpture about a sculpture, was not the only time Caro has looked closely at existing works of art and used them as a starting point. A table piece which bridges a corner, which is Déjeuner sur l'herbe. Again, if you look hard, you can find bits that remind you of things in the painting. But Caro's working method is never to have a reproduction of the work of art that he's starting from in his studio. He relies on his memory. The things that interested him the most when he was looking are the things that turn up in the sculpture. That big round piece that's in the space between the two supports obviously derives from the still life in the front. It's clearly much more important in the sculpture than it is in the painting. It interested Caro as much or more than the seated figures. The gesture of the man, the Marcantonio version of the river god, in the painting becomes the long extended figure, abstracted element on the right, and so on. I suppose you could say that that small hourglass shape in the middle has something to do with the waiting woman. But again, he's relying on his memory, not on the picture itself. And that, I think, is something very different from the way Frankenthaler habitually worked, who she would keep a closer tie to her starting point. As I said, we can take this chain back exactly the way we can trace the young students at the New York City, at the School of American Ballet's connection to the court of Louis XIV with various steps along the way, since of course Manet was himself looking at the Titian. A table piece called The Deluge, which goes back to 1969, has a similar relationship to Leonardo's drawings. Again, not literal, but evocative of Caro's experience of these drawings and the things that impressed him the most. A celebrated work like Orangery, 1969, which is one of the most acclaimed of Caro's early polychrome sculptures, is the other end of the spectrum of possibilities. On one end, you have Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which is based on a specific work that Caro has looked hard at many times and is reprising in the sculpture. In the middle is something like The Deluge, where you're getting a kind of general impression of something that he enjoyed. And then with Orangery, it seems very Matisseian. In fact, a collector of Caro's, who has an extraordinary group of his works, told me a few days ago when I happened to see him in Boston that he regretted bitterly not having acquired Orangery when he had a chance to acquire it in '69, because he thought it was too Matisseian. It wasn't enough Caro. And yet, there's no Matisse that has any of those elements. It's as though Caro has distilled an impression of the elements of the gouache coupé, the cutout shapes, and turned them into something which is wholly sculptural, wholly Caro, and yet, because his feeling about Matisse is so strong, it still comes through as having this Matisse characteristic. Those twisted forms started out as plowshares that he altered, and yet they read like pieces of the blue nudes. And there's yet another connection, or another kind of connection. 1977, Caro was invited to lead a workshop in a remote region of rural Canada, northern Saskatchewan. He knew that there were not going to be wonderful facilities. In fact, the sculpture studio was actually the parking lot in those days, the only thing big enough for him. And he knew that there was no way that he could get the large, heavy slabs of metal that he had been working on the previous couple of years up to this place, which is, I think, an hour and a half north of Prince Albert, which is not exactly a metropolis. And so he decided he would have to work with very light materials. And to get himself going, he made a bunch of drawings after 1920s Picasso's. This 1927-28, the studio is quite, the kitchen is quite typical. And the sculptures, this is one on the left is called Emma Landing, very large, reflect that experience of the drawing, very, very inspired, very directed by those linear Picassos, which he leaned on for support in this venture. But again, like Orangery, not one-on-one. Sometimes it is one-on-one. These are two works which were made a few years apart. Mosque, which is a table piece, made 79-80, and Moroccans, which incorporates ceramic and wood elements as well as steel, made between 83 and 87. And they are both extrapolated from Matisse's The Moroccans. But typically, what does Caro go for? The upper left. He has turned that configuration of marabout, balcony, and plant into sculptural forms. And in the Moroccans on the right, I mean, that's an enormous sculpture. The platform, a lower platform, is probably at least 6 feet square, maybe a little bigger. So he's, again, blown these elements apart. You can find a connection between the, if you like, the paddles on that cactus, which are in a more, if you like, conventional relationship to the dome of the marabout, although the dome of the marabout is totally flat in Caro's sculptures, and to the railing of the balcony in the little sculpture called Mosque. You can even find a cognate between the melons in the foreground and the arching supports. But by the time he rethinks it, by the time he's doing it large, all of these elements have taken their place in new relationships. And yet there is this, I would say, added dimension of being haunted by Matisse. It's as though you're privileged to get into Caro's head and discover what his likes and dislikes are, and what sticks with him and what doesn't. He's totally ignoring the right-hand side of the painting. Maybe because the pieces are so dispersed that he doesn't see them in a three-dimensional fashion. He got very interested in the 80s and 90s in this kind of very specific relationship to works of art, but without having a reminder of the work at hand, as I keep saying. So I think what you get is a really clear diagram of what catches his attention. It's rather like those drawings you see of our sense of what a human body is like based on our sensory perceptions. The head, the lips, the hands are always way out of proportion to everything else, because that's where we really taste and touch and are aware of our contact with the world. The rest kind of, just connects it. So you get these strange conflations and elisions and transformations, which is what makes these things into good sculpture, that are based on Caro's recollections and his obsessions of the moment. The very clear relationship of a table piece called Dark Wood, and I don't know whether that refers to what it's made out of. It's made of steel, as far as I know. Or maybe he's just interested in those plants in the background of Blue Nude Souvenir Biskra. It's the elements that dominate are not the elements that you would expect to dominate, although there are two large, rounded, sliced forms in the appropriate place. So he's not immune to her charms, but he really likes those ferns in the background. The clue that he is not relying on a reproduction, but on memory, is very explicitly documented by this table piece, which is also from the early 90s, or 94, called Act of War After Goya. Like Manet, Caro is often absolutely explicit about the sources. And here, it's the thrust of the soldiers' weapons on the right, the Y shape, which is split. It becomes like a memory of the way one figure overlaps the figure with his arms thrown up, but the overlap is on the other side. So he's remembering that there's that overlap, but how he's using it is not totally related to Goya. A pile of things in the foreground, which is the pile of bodies, and then that inexplicable slice, that moon shape in the hollow, which I think is a kind of equivalent for the dramatic light, the memory of that shaft of light in the center of that painting. The theatrical illumination at a time, 1808, there was no spotlight. So this is like Caravaggio, a cinematic lighting that is clearly invented by the artist, and which Caro was passionately interested in. And again, keeping the chain going, Manet was equally obsessed with that painting and painted it many times, never quite doing it to his satisfaction. He was using as his theme the execution of the Emperor Maximilian in Mexico, a news story which was very, very scandalous at the time. This is the Mannheim version of the painting, but he kept doing it over and over again, and never quite exorcised his enthusiasm, his fascination, his wish that he had painted that painting. Caro being able to do it in steel was perhaps less obsessed with the original painting and feeling less rivalry with it. One of the most interesting connections for me, because it took me a while to figure out what was going on, I saw a group of works in the studio called which Caro said, oh yes, I'm going to call that the Arena series, and I had no idea why. There's something felt vaguely familiar about these massive wood shapes. This is a relatively small sculpture. It's less than 3 feet high, as all the series are. And then I remembered that he'd been in Italy the summer before and had gone to Padua and had seen the Giottos. This one is Arena series beginning. And that sliced piece of wood is a distillation of the mass and bulk and weight of Giotto's figures, specifically, in this case, inspired by Joachim sleeping. This is the dream of Joachim. Perhaps that diagonal has to do with the pyramidal shape of the sleeping man. And of course, the architecture, just as it's the mosque in the Matisse that captured his attention, it's that schematic shepherd's hut that becomes this sheltering trestle. The solid forms, these geometric forms that buttress it, I think, again, are a distillation of the weight and the bulk of the Giottos. So again, even though he is saying this is beginning, this is a very early moment in the narrative, the Great Cycle, but it is nothing that specific. It's a total experience of a group of works that impressed him deeply. At other times, it's very, very specific. The National Gallery in London owns this Van Gogh. And in 1988, the director of the National Gallery invited a number of artists to make work about works in the National Gallery collection. Caro chose the Van Gogh, and he made something like 5 sculptures, which are very, very specifically about the painting, but transform it into completely sculptural terms. You can find the things that interest him. Again, he's combining materials here, great slabs of stoneware and steel. The little items resting on the chair find their way into at least one of these sculptures, not into all of the others. What he gets interested in is the relationship of the room and the tip plane of the chair and the floor. And that's what eventually dominates. And the last works of the series, I think these are the 3rd and 4th. The whole painting becomes the subject in the work on the right. A few years later, this was such an interesting project to the director. Then in '99, he invited Caro to do something else about a work in the National Gallery. And this time, Caro chose the tiny little Duco. I think there's something like 12 or 15 large freestanding sculptures. You know, the Duco is about this big. The sculptures are about 5 foot square. And typically, what Caro is interested in is the architecture. The protagonists are there only by implication. One of these, each one is in a different material. There's one in brass, there's one in wood, there's one in plexiglass, several of them in steel. And in one of them, there's the only indication that anything's happening in this structure is a bowl-shaped form which is on a horizontal slab. If you remember the painting, you say, oh yes, it's the vase of lilies. But it's the relationship of these abstract forms to the rectangle, punctuated by these human forms that themselves get translated into things that are totally unrecognizable, that kept Caro going and led to this enormous series of works. Knowing about these source sculptures, as Caro calls them, has made me think in different ways about his work, which is apparently non-referential. This is the first of a series of stepped architectural scale works that he has been revisiting at intervals since '94, when this one was made, specifically in a Victorian carpet factory near Leeds. It's since been altered, it's now installed somewhere else, but there have been a number of variations of these step pieces that are like warped archways. The geometry is inexplicable. It starts out doing this, but then you realize everything's skewed and things are slightly turned and nothing is the same size. It's a progression that you can thread through and move around these big curved space plates that join it. So your progress is very directed by the sculpture. I believe now that there is probably some kind of connection between these passageway pieces and the architectural forms that Caro has extracted from various paintings over the way. I think that notion of an inhabited architecture owes something to those images, as well as to the experience of simply moving through things in normal life. And having been alerted to that, I've started thinking differently about his most recent preoccupations. For about the last 15 years, he has been making increasingly opaque, dense, volumetric sculpture. This is the man who made works like Orangery that were described very accurately as drawing in space, very linear, very delicate. He's allowed mass and volume to re-enter the work in a major way. And these mysterious pieces that are about the size of grand pianos and have the same weight and presence. One is called Night and Dreams, one is called First Light, are, as I say, very mysterious. They exclude us. We can't see into the top as a rule. The photographer must have been standing on something to take this one. Of the work on the left. When you do peer over the top, there seems to be some kind of ritual, possibility of enacting some kind of ritual, but you don't know what it is. The sides are opaque. You can see a little bit underneath. They push you away. They suggest that something very important is happening, but you can't quite tell what. And I would argue that part of that quality of imminence, of potency, of some special event has to do with Caro's profound interest in the art of his predecessors, with all of the contained narratives, with all of the representation, with all of the iconography that inform them. He may not address those things specifically in his own work, but his sense of connection to them, I would say, animates his work, and as Frankenthaler's in the same way, makes that work more potent and more interesting for us to look at. Thank you.